attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar, Coding for Communities, a Pragmatic Guide to Zoning Reform, hosted by the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network and is partially funded by the U.S. EPA Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that serves as your one-stop on the web for the most current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. We provide news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Clearinghouse on smart growth topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website in the next couple of days under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and subscribe to our e-newsletter to get the latest news and information about smart growth and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Today's webinar has a name similar to the Form-Based Codes Institute at Smart Growth America's Codes for Communities program. Smart Growth America is another one of the Smart Growth Network partners. Information on that program is available at formbasedcodes.org/codes-for-communities. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To log your CM credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Coding for Communities, a Pragmatic Guide to Zoning Reform. You can also search for event number 918-1206. And if you are watching as a group, you are able to log your credits individually at the website. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. So to get started, our speakers today are Lynn Richards and Susan Henderson. Lynn Richards is President and CEO of the Congress for the New Urbanism. As head of CNU, Lynn has launched the organization's Project for Code Reform, which helps meet local governments where they are on their code reform process. An internationally recognized speaker and leader on new urbanism, Lynn has led projects and presented on a range of topics, including economic development, highway removal and transformation, suburban retrofits, green infrastructure, and trends in new urbanism. Prior to leading CNU, Lynn had a long and distinguished career at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, holding multiple leadership roles over 13 years, including acting director and policy director in the Office of Sustainable Communities. She worked with dozens of state and local governments to implement placemaking approaches by developing policies, urban design strategies, and environmental solutions for vibrant, prosperous neighborhoods. Additionally, she produced groundbreaking research on water and land use strategies. An architect, urbanist, and writer, Susan Henderson of Placemakers LLC combines a wealth of practical experience with stellar project management skills to lead the most complicated projects. LEED AP certified, Susan brings an expertise in sustainability to code writing and continues to lead an ever-increasing number of town planning and coding endeavors for her firm. Susan is a board member for the Congress for the New Urbanism and the Form-Based Codes Institute. Following the presentations, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during their presentations by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Now we're going to do a couple of poll questions for everybody so that we can get a sense of who is in the audience today. So you'll be able to, as we pull up these questions, select your response on the screen. The first one is, what is your role in local government? You can select planner or manager in a planning agency, elected official, appointed, board or commission member, or staff of another agency? We'll give you a couple minutes to respond. Okay, so we can see here that most of the group by far are planner or manager in an agency or staff of another agency. So we'll move on to the second question. Manage the poll question. Okay, the second question is, what is the size or population of your jurisdiction? And you can see the categories there. Okay, so you can see the distribution there. So many of our attendees today are in smaller communities. And then there's a number of them probably in cities of larger than 300,000. Okay, the third question we're pulling up. Okay, so what are some of the obstacles that you have found to your work in creating more walkable mixed-use communities? You can see streetscape, form, for example, height and frontage, uses, infrastructure issues, and other obstacles. And you can select multiple ones of these. Okay, so we're getting, it looks like we'll close it momentarily here, but I think we'll see that there's quite a common, I mean, all of these seem to be issues across our respondents here. So the most cited infrastructure issue is at 59%, but all of them have at least almost half. So interesting distribution there. And then we're going to queue up our next question. I think this is going to be, oh, we're ready to go. Okay, so following our presentations, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during the presentation by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. So now we're going to get started, and I'm going to turn it over to Lynn, and she's going to present. Thank you, Lynn, and welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. And thank you, John and Michael, for teeing this up. I have to say that talking about the Project for Code Reform and what we've been able to do is one of my most favorite things that I like to do. We think it's a nice disruption to how coding is done. So what Susan and I are going to talk about today is give you a little bit of background on the Project for Code Reform and incremental coding approach, talk a little bit about our process and approach. Susan will present the bulk of the content, and then we'll do Q&A. But I'd like to first start by talking about why do we do code overhaul. And at its simplest form, it's really to make investment easier in places. This is a picture of Columbia Pike in Arlington, Virginia, and it was a corridor that has seen, frankly, decades of disinvestment by the late 90s. They were able to change the code, and in changing the code, they were able to, they changed the code in 2003, and as of 2015, they had more than 1,000 new housing units, 250,000 square feet of retail, and another 600 homes and another 25,000 square feet of retail that were planned and approved. And these numbers, as I said, are from 2015, and development keeps going. So what are some of the biggest coding issues that communities are seeing? And what I'm about to show you tracks really well with the poll that we had before. We have a lot of parking issues. Many communities are overparked. They require on-site parking in inappropriate places. There's no on-street parking that is allowed. No on-street parking that is allowed. Parking is required on site. Sidewalk activities are prohibited. This would be illegal in so many, this picture would be illegal in so many different places. You have wide lanes and high speeds. So again, the outcome that we're seeking is to create a vibrant, prosperous place, one that is walkable, one where people want to spend time in, right? Whether it is in a small town, a suburb, or in your downtown area, people like to be in these diverse, vibrant places. And so when you have wide lanes and high speeds, it makes it really difficult to create that kind of pedestrian environment. Additionally, you have narrow sidewalks, required front setbacks, blank walls are allowed. Nobody would like to walk along that particular sidewalk. Limited uses, no zoning codes don't allow for small scale manufacturing. Retail is required everywhere. Folks really want to have an active street front, and the way they get to that is requiring retail instead of just saying, let's have an active street front. So why don't more communities, and there's a host of other, I just went through some of the kind of top hits that most communities face. And so why don't we have more coding changes? And the answer is pretty simple. It's incredibly expensive right now and really complicated. And a great example of this is the Code Next project in Austin, Texas, which I think has been going on now for almost 7 years, and it has cost the city almost $8 million, and they still don't have a code. So a complete code overhaul takes a long time, requires incredible political will, and a lot of public buy-in. So we started thinking about this. I started thinking about this, right? And as John said, I worked for the EPA for a number of years and was involved in the production of a number of coding documents, essential code fixes for urban communities, essential code fixes for suburban communities. The American Planning Association has a 500-page model code ordinance. The CNU, before I joined, created the SMART code, and so on and so on. And these national level documents, while can be incredibly helpful, they're almost too vague. It becomes like, now what am I supposed to do? And then so what most people focus on is at the individual or at the city level, right? There's 42,000 units of local government in the United States with zoning authority. So the question becomes, how can we change this? How can we get code changes to cities, particularly small and mid-sized cities that don't have a lot of the staff capacity, more quickly? And so that's why we launched the Project for Code Reform. We took the problem, okay, cities need to change their codes. They want more walkable, prosperous places. They change their codes, but they can't afford to bring in the consultant. It's a huge process. Can we somehow disrupt that? And that's really what the Project for Code Reform is. It turned the problem on its side. And the process, it shows here in one slide, but this process took us almost 4 years to create. So instead of looking at it at a national level, and instead of looking at it at a individual municipality or jurisdiction level, let's instead look at it at a state level. So can we create some quick fixes, some essential coding elements that could apply at the state level? Now, local land use issues are absolutely a local issue, but it doesn't take a big stretch to understand that some of the land use regulations are going to be a little bit different in New Mexico than they are in Michigan. So what is the state-based opportunities and constraints? Not necessarily so much the enabling legislation, but rather what are the biggest problems within that state. And so that's the research phase. The second piece of it is hearing directly from the localities. And so part of our process is we spend a considerable amount of time having localities come in and present to us what works, what doesn't work, and where they're getting really stuck. We have an analysis bit where we call it kind of walking in the woods, wandering in the woods. We do recommendations that translate that code and that directly responds to local conditions within that state. We document it in creating an easily accessible information, and then we do training and education. And I want to walk through what this looked like in the state of Michigan, which was our very first state. And the reason why it was our first state was that in 2015, we were in Detroit for CNU 24, and some of our partners there, the Michigan Municipal League, the Michigan State and Housing Development Authority, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, became really strong partners. And as we talked about the project for code reform, they became intensely interested in, like, hey, let's do this within the state, primarily because MEDC, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, had a program called Redevelopment Ready. So how can the state of Michigan provide additional resources to those communities in Michigan which are redevelopment ready? So looking at or creating a tool that the communities could use for coding was a perfect fit. So another key piece of the work that we do here is that we don't do it alone. While CNU has incredible in-house expertise, not only through our staff, but through our members, the issue at the very end of the implementation, the education and outreach, getting the information in, what are the constraints of the local, absolutely had to be done with a range of partners. And so we created a team that include the Michigan APA, AARP, and again, MISHDA and MEDC. We had some initial funding from the Richard H. Driehaus Prize from Notre Dame on this as well. So we kicked this off, I want to say, almost 3 years ago, and this is what we call wandering in the woods. After you do the research of the state-based, after you hear from the localities, this is part of the analysis. Like, what are the zoning hacks? What are the coding hacks that's going to best respond to local conditions? And as much as we talk about wandering in the woods as a joke, we were 3 days in this particular room. We in the end have decided that this is actually an essential part of the process, because it can't be cooker cutting. We can't take what we learned in Michigan and apply it to a different state. That while we're not doing it jurisdiction by jurisdiction, it absolutely can be done at the state level, but it requires really fine-tuning the zoning changes that we're recommending to a state-based context. And where we landed, and I'm going to reference Rick Bernhardt, a former planning director of Nashville, this became our touchstone. If you do nothing else, do this. And this is the arc of engagement for us became, if you do nothing else, do this, because what we're trying to do is not take business as usual, which is single-use zoning, and go all the way to a new city code, but rather to say, if you do nothing else, do this one thing. So we're not guaranteeing a great place. So the American Planning Association's 500-page model code guarantees a great place. The SMART code guarantees a great place. So many form-based codes guarantee a great place. The project for code reform is code style agnostic. It works within a form-based code. It works within the SMART code. It works within Euclidean zoning. It's designed to do just a very small thing, just in one area, just do this one thing. And if it worked, try something else, right? So that's what we mean by this incremental code reform. Instead of spending an incredible amount of time, energy, and money to do a complete overhaul, just start slowly and do one piece. So when we started thinking about, and I'll just take parking as an example of coding recommendations, it became clear that your parking requirements in your main street is going to be very different from your parking requirements in a more adjacent neighborhood or in your residential area. right? Makes a lot of sense. The density requirements are going to be different, that your frontage requirements are going to be different. So Mary Madden from Farrell Madden came up with this idea of like, we've got to be grounded in place. So as we were determining the different kind of zoning recommendations, we realized we needed to be grounded in place, and grounded in place in those place types that were unique to Michigan. And so much like that poll that you took in the beginning, while there are hundreds of coding changes that could be made, we felt that streetscape form, use, frontage, and parking were those areas that would deliver the greatest amount of benefit to communities that were looking to modify their codes. So again, we're not looking at doing everything, but if you do nothing else, just to start, go here, do this. And additionally, when we start the document, the very first sentence on it says, "Are you ready for wholesale code reform?" If yes, this document's not for you. If no, read on. So what we found in working with Michigan, which has so many small and mid-sized towns, is that they didn't want to do a whole code overhaul. They wanted just to change one thing or two things or a number very small. Very small changes. The other advantage of doing an incremental code reform is enabling the local government or the jurisdiction to change one thing at a time, to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So when the council is voting on a wholesale package, they may like 90% of what's in there, but there's 10% of it that is really problematic. And that 10% can torpedo the whole code, the whole code reform effort. So in this way, by doing it incrementally, you still get the public engagement, you still get the council involved, but you're moving together through the process collaboratively. So we released the first document in September of 2018. This is Enabling Better Places, User's Guide to Zoning Reform for the State of Michigan. We've seen thousands of downloads. Lisa Seamus, my communications manager, is really tired of me asking for the update. It's been received incredibly well in Michigan and in other places. Dan Gilmartin in particular, who was the executive director and CEO of the Michigan Municipal League, really felt that this was a game changer for Michigan local governments. Now, I'm not so sure how well it would work in a place like Detroit, but we already have seen Albion, town of 8,000, Kalamazoo, town of 35,000, take up some of the recommendations here and to move forward. But we're continuing with this. It's not, we call it research. So as soon as it was released, Vermont called us up and said, hey, can you come here and do research on what are the incremental coding elements that can I just lost my train of thought. Incremental coding elements that can support or help facilitate more affordable housing. Michigan, after ground truthing the final document to say, hey, this is great, it's really working well, but we now need to look at what are some incremental code changes for the suburban condition. That document, if we're lucky, will be released this fall, a year later. Palm Beach, the town of Palm Beach, wants to explore what's the incremental approach to wholesale change. So while so much of our work has been focused on, that arc of engagement, just if you do this, do nothing else, Palm Beach wants to take it all the way to a wholesale code change, but applying the incremental approach. So we're working with them to figure out how to do that. And other states are contacting us that have issues around the population boom, historic preservation, green space, and stormwater. Increasingly, we love talking to cities or states because we feel that this is a fundamental disruption to how coding occurs. And the only way that we can continue this research is by partnering with cities and states that can enable us to explore a particular issue in depth. We are confident in the methodology in grounding it in a particular place with considerable partners, and that methodology of doing the research, the analysis, the recommendation, and the documentation, and then following up with training and education, we feel is essential to the overall success. And this winter, we will be creating a kind of one-time training program for the state of Michigan. We also want to disrupt that process. So it's not, you know, consultant for life or CNU for life, but rather how can we create a training program that leverages the incredibly strong relationships that we have in Michigan and create a kind of train the trainers, create a multiplier effect. So we will go into the state of Michigan once both documents are done with a training program, one day specifically for local governments, one day specifically for all of our different partners, and then the third is for the consultants that are working there. And in this way, we hope that we can just go in once and provide people with the knowledge that they have to continue moving this forward within the state of Michigan. So we will come back with answering a lot of questions, but now I want to pass this over to Susan to give you a few more details, actually a lot more details on what those specific coding elements are. Susan?
Thanks, Lynn. So I will go into the weeds here about well, I guess there's two things. One is this is all grounded in the reality of Michigan, and we would like to give you enough work that as professional planners, you can begin to even implement some of these changes incrementally within your community, although it is fairly complex. And that's one reason, like Lynn said, why we found it very effective to work at the state level. So the guide for Michigan, like mentioned, Lynn has already covered the background. We're not going to go into the resources. So today I'm just going to deal with the bulk of the document, which is the guide. And Lynn has already essentially showed you the slide that looks, we realized, like she mentioned, Mary Madden and others of us really felt very strongly that you have to know where you are, because everything changes in a regulatory fashion from place to place, whether it's main streets, downtowns, urban neighborhoods, or even the suburban condition. And to understand what your infrastructure hurdles are in each situation, and not only to deal with, I was really glad to see that there were other agencies that are involved in the webinar, because as much as coding is a product of and is owned by the planning department, the reality is the fire marshal and the public works department, the municipal engineer, there's so many other departments that are critical players in the infrastructure world, and that varies dramatically from place to place. So Lynn mentioned this, and I just want to go into a little more detail about the story of if you do nothing else, do this. A few years ago, I think it was in Dallas, a few of us at CNU were having lunch with Rick Bernhardt, and he was the planning director of Nashville, Tennessee. And if y'all aren't familiar, sorry, my Southern came out there. If you aren't familiar with Nashville, they have done neighborhood-based, form-based codes for, it's like 20 some odd neighborhoods in the city. And Rick was up against a very skeptical planning commission and city council. And so he decided to begin to get them on board with code reform. He needed to pick the little things, the things that made the most difference. So essentially in our firm, we call it doing the biggest little thing. So if you do nothing else, do this. And Rick, for him in Nashville, it was having a build-to line as well as a setback, and requiring that the parking is located behind the building or on street. And so finding your way through this guide really involves this statement: if you do nothing else, do this. And Lynn has mentioned that in great detail. So we began by building these buckets of areas of reform. And maybe it is your streetscapes that need the most help, or to loosen up the flexibility within your uses, or to begin to address your frontages. And many municipalities, it's the issue with parking. And so And all of these, Lynn already went over this, but it is the issue of finding the little things that can have the greatest impact. And this is step one in the arc of engagement that we use to illustrate the project for code reform. So the number one thing to be aware of is whatever you do at the smallest scale, make sure that it has the greatest impact on the vibrancy of the area and the pedestrian activity. So I'm going to go through each of those areas of reform and give you my hit list. And this is not the big exhaustive list that's in the guide, but it's just the things that I personally feel like have the greatest impact, that if I were only dealing with frontages, here are the 3 things I would do. And so in frontages, this is a photo I took a few years ago in Paris. And yeah, I know we're not Paris, right? But there are some things that we can learn from them. And actually what was amazing to me about this image, I should have shown an entire street. This was this exquisite frontage on really a pretty shady, unenjoyable street. It was in a questionable part of town, but you came upon this florist shop and suddenly you saw this piece of magic. And so there are these 3 rules that we would recommend that you consider first. The first one is to set a maximum front setback. So if this building were pushed back away from the street and the sidewalk, the impact of the sidewalk display would be much, much less. So that's back to Rick's recommendation of having build-to lines. The second one is to require usable entries facing the street. And because of the suburbanization of America, so often we find that even with 0 front setbacks, many, if there's a rear parking lot, many retailers are going to have their primary entrance facing the parking lot. And so they may put in a door, but often you're going to have to add a regulation such as the door remains unlocked and unblocked during open hours, or something to that effect that requires the entries are usable. And then finally, requiring a minimum transparency. The wonderful thing about this image that I love so much is it is clear glass, and it's about 90% of the ground floor facade. And because it's transparent, it's not tinted, it's not reflective, you can see all the way to the rear of the shop. You can see the interior displays as well as the vibrancy at the street itself. Here's another example of that from New Orleans. This is probably one of my all-time favorite storefronts. And it has the very tall, clear stories above the shop front, where it's daylighting the entire depth of the store. And as a result, you can see, once again, all the way to the rear of the shop. And there's just something about it that draws you in. Now, we could go into great detail, and many municipalities make this mistake of trying to regulate architecture and materials and window proportions. And frankly, my opinion is reserve that for a pattern book or historic district guidelines. But when you're doing the incremental changes to your zoning, these simple rules are really all that you need. That is setback, functional entry, and minimum transparent glazing. So for streetscapes, Lynn already mentioned this, establish or protect on-street parking. And in so many of our cities, we're seeing there's this, especially historic cities, we're seeing this effort to make sure there is staging area for ladder trucks, and on-street parking is being removed. And that is a huge loss to local businesses, especially in a 0 setback retail environment. There must be teaser parking on the street for these businesses to be successful. And in addition, it requires, it provides what is essentially a buffer zone of sheet metal that it provides safety for the pedestrians. And because of these two reasons, this is one of our first goals when we do zoning, whether it's a complete form-based code or a unified development code for a municipality. And then also at this incremental level of the project for code reform, it's something we recommend you consider immediately in the areas you're trying to revitalize. This is a picture from Excelsior, Minnesota, just west of the Twin Cities, which shows that if you have that on-street parking, then it creates that incredibly comfortable space for the pedestrian, in so much that with all of the potential car doors opening and people getting pulling in and out in their vehicles, it also essentially slows down the traffic. So you see this pedestrian that's crossing mid-block. I refuse to use the word jaywalking, but the street is slow enough and comfortable enough and safe enough that it almost becomes shared space. The next item is used, the next bucket, and this is a new community right outside of Louisville, Kentucky called Norton Commons that we had the honor of working with a few years ago. And it's an example of how you can do this today. And so this isn't limited to historic areas and to the cities that we all know and love and aspire to be, like New Orleans and Paris, but you can even apply the simplicity of uses to new communities. And so permitting mixed use by right. Many local governments that we work with don't want residential in their downtowns, and there's a deep resistance to apartments, and that's a political barrier that a lot of local governments are trying to overcome. And then once again, it's like over the decades of using a code, people discover this one tiny little use that is obnoxious, and as a result, you can have, I've seen zoning codes for small municipalities. We worked with one in Wisconsin that was about 100,000 people, and they had a 13-page use table. And so to be able to say the difference between a day spa and a barbershop, to me, that is a level of complexity that doesn't help anyone, especially in pursuit of economic development. So once again, looking at New Orleans, the thing I want to illustrate about use is these historic buildings have been designed in such a way that they have evolved dozens of times over the centuries that they've been here. And that the main level, they've been entirely residential at one era of their life. They have been entirely commercial at another. And today you'll find them retail and office on the main level and residential and or office above. And in contrast, the high rise you see at the termination of the street, has a single use. It can only be used for office because that's the way it was designed. And because of the building codes that it was subject to, that building has no flexibility to evolve as the economy changes. And so what we try to do in encouraging greater flexibility in use is to also incentivize builders and developers to produce buildings that have the potential to change over time. Finally, Lynn went over this in great detail, so I won't focus on it too much, but it is the issue of requiring the parking lots to be located behind the building. This is a picture from Savannah. This gives you the ability to inhabit your sidewalks for the local businesses with cafes, or to increase the pedestrian capacity with the wider sidewalks. It also, like we said again before, creates that teaser parking that's required for successful mixed use. And I'd like to say that Savannah is like one of my, well, I think it is my favorite city in the United States for urbanism and architecture. But even in Savannah, they went through eras of getting it wrong. And so having your parking shielded just is so critical to the vibrancy of the street. This is a fantastic block that's adjacent to one of the squares in Savannah. It could have been incredibly urban. And what you don't see to the left of the image is a lovely row of urban houses. But because this building, the structured parking was done in the 70s in an era when frontages weren't valued, what you have as a result is an incredibly unfriendly pedestrian environment, and so much so that it has a surface parking lot across the street from it. So I think we can't emphasize enough how important parking location is to the success of your communities. So one thing we did in Michigan is we built model districts. And if you download the Enabling Better Places PDF from the CNU website, you can actually go through and see what, for the state of Michigan, we consider to be the most critical things. And in doing each of these model districts, it was based on the conventional Euclidean format. There's no pictures, no diagrams, no tables. It is what people expect. We were trying to flatten the learning curve and to produce something that could be done as a simple text amendment. So if you have a main street that currently has suburban standards, you could replace it with something similar to this Main Street district, just dealing with the very simple things about expansive uses, parking location, and some very, very simple frontage requirements. So I would encourage you to take a look at this. In this section of the guide, there's a quick start guide that gives you essentially what you do first, and we'll go into that in a little more detail. So as we discussed earlier, you determine where you're going to use the district. Is it Main Street, downtown, or adjacent neighborhood, or in some situations a combination of downtowns and adjacent neighborhoods. And this is sorry, this is duplicative now that we've been through Lynn's and my presentation, but the question just simply is, who and where are you? And what do you aspire to be? And knowing where you are and who you are gives you the resources you need to make the incremental changes. So then determining the scope and selecting the districts. And we were encouraging the Michigan municipalities to start very small. So if you're going to use one of these model districts and you have at least the bones of a main street, just start with that. That's the simplest quick fix. And then you can evolve it or expand it over time. So the first question is, how much change do you need? Is it just preservation? Is your main street fairly intact? Do you need to enhance it? Has it begun to transition into a suburban format, perhaps on the ends? Or do you really need wholesale transformation? Another equal question is, are you simply enabling? It's like Lynn mentioned earlier, we're not requiring the good necessarily, and we're not guaranteeing the good. Perhaps we're just enabling it. Or are there things that you actually want to prohibit, like parking in front? And then are there things that you are going to require, like transparent glazing? The next step is to map the districts. Where do the standards apply? These were icons we developed, the one on the left being a complete downtown, and then a couple of main streets across in the middle, and finally a simple, this was an example from Michigan, a simple little 3-block main street of one of their villages. And so understanding where and how to map it is crucial to your success, because obviously mapping main street conditions on a commercial corridor could lead to some negative unintended consequences. We'll get to that in a second. So the first question is, where do they apply? And the most common answer is pedestrian sheds, a common smart growth term. Basically, how far are people willing to walk within 5 minutes? And usually these tend to be more of our historic or urban areas. They can also apply to primary retail corridors or main streets. And then finally to park once environments. If you have like a real downtown that has office and employment as well as retail and housing, that's very self-evident that it would be an appropriate location. And then one other big thing to be aware of is knowing your market, because like I mentioned earlier, if you try to apply Main Street standards to an auto-centric context that isn't walkable today, likely it's going to have very detrimental effects on the businesses. So being very cautious and strategic about the market and the impact on the market is quite important. Next, understand that mixed use by proximity really does have influence on how you map the standards also. For example, the adjacent neighborhoods. They may not be inherently mixed use themselves, but because of their proximity to a main street or a downtown, they become very, very usable for coding reform. So this is my final slide, and then I'll turn it back over for question answer. But I guess as an urbanist and architect and a longtime zoning nerd, I think if there are 3 things, if you can do nothing else, do this. And this is across all of the different buckets of reform. Set the maximum front setback. If you really want to activate your street and enhance pedestrian activity and begin to see economic development, putting a maximum on the front setback are essentially creating a build to line. We usually like to create a range, so from 0 to 8 or 0 to 12 to permit room for sidewalk cafes. That is ideal. Secondly, requiring the parking lots to be behind the buildings. I think this is just, without question, the most critical item in code reform and in creating places people love, our placemaking in general. And then finally, permitting compatible uses in most districts. And we're seeing some major shifts in densification of residential, like with the big news in single-family residential districts. That hasn't been reflected in their zoning yet, but hopefully we'll see something come out of that. So we're seeing diversity begin within existing districts become more desirable by communities. And we'd just like to make the case that general retail, general office, and residential single family detached, those are really very compatible uses. And you might what we like to do is control intensity without being overly prescriptive about use. And you'll have to fine tune that for your local government, for your local environment. But it's something that you might begin to consider, at least permit residential in your downtowns. And with that, I'll turn it back over to John.
Great. This is Michael. Thank you, Susan, and thank you,
Sorry,
Lynn,
Michael.
for the presentation. That's okay. So we're going to have both of our panelists kind of turn on their webcam so you can see them as we do the Q&A. And as those of you who've been on these webinars that we do, we usually go to about 2:30. We'll plan to do that again. And I will say that this is probably our best attended webinar, and we've already received many questions. But if you do have one, you can continue to submit them as we go forward here under the questions tab, and we'll ask as many as we have time for. Excellent. Okay, and so we can see our panelists here. Okay, so the first question is for Lynn, and this was earlier on in the presentation. Somebody noted that their city in Natchez, Mississippi, a population of about 15,000, adopted a revitalization plan that partially focuses on changing land uses downtown to create cultural districts such as entertainment, arts, African American civil rights, etc. Have you seen success with the designation of cultural districts in small historic towns?
Oh, absolutely. There have been, and Susan, I'm going to tag this over to you as well. There have been a number of places that I know that have really leveraged the cultural district as a way of revitalization. And in fact, we've been working in West Side Atlanta, which is impoverished community that is about a 10, 15-minute drive from the central business district. And it's the home of not only Martin Luther King, but a number of African-American
questions just aren't going to be addressed.
Elements that are have been key for helping the West Side start the revitalization effort. So a number of communities, particularly small communities, have used that successfully. Susan, you also have wide experience. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Well, I just would add to be careful with that, because frequently we've actually seen where if you give a cultural designation, you can have unintended consequences. And by that I mean we've worked quite a bit in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where they did that to begin with, trying to revitalize a dead downtown, and they wound up getting like 6 museums, and because museums are 9 to 5, you know, and they put them in a couple of blocks, they killed 2 blocks. So we would recommend that use it very, very carefully and strategically, because it really can cause problems if you don't diversify or spread out the uses of limited hours.
Or integrate other uses within the cultural district area. But I think it's a really effective tool for helping to kickstart the revitalization efforts, particularly in underserved communities that have such a rich history.
Okay, thank you. I will note that for both of you that the questions are pouring in, so we'll try to ask as many as we can. You may want to go a little quicker with your responses so we can get to them, but which is okay. I mean, I think this is great. That's a great format. Some specific questions here. What about maximum front setbacks along inhospitable commercial corridors such as major arterials? What about that?
Can I start, Lynn?
Yeah, and I'm going to jump.
I would be I would avoid that. I just would avoid it. It's not, you have to, in fact, we both, you know, made a big deal about knowing where you are. And so and this is a form-based code answer, not a project for code reform answer, but the only smart code we ever saw overturned was in Biloxi, Mississippi, where they applied a 0 front setback to a suburban arterial. And there are 2 different operating systems, and they really don't cohabitate. So if you're going to do code reform for your suburban condition, you can do it, but it has to be done with incredible finesse and very strategically.
Yeah, I hear what Susan is saying. I know a number of other examples. Actually, I'm thinking of Littleton, Colorado. As a for example, I'm thinking of Tyson's Corners as another example whereby as a process of transforming that suburban arterial is moving the buildings closer to the street. Now there's a wide difference between moving the buildings closer to the street and requiring a zero setback. In those cases where I've seen it done successfully, you have a wide sidewalk, you have maybe 10 to 15 feet of grass, and then you have double entrances, both from the sidewalk and from the back where the parking is. But Susan, I have seen it done in a way that helps the kind of transformation of that suburban arterial. But I think she disagrees. But again, it needs to be done with a great deal. I think we're in agreement that it needs to be done with a great deal of finesse and care.
Okay. Another question. In the smallest towns with non-historic strip malls, how are you able to develop the downtown without rezoning the entire zoning structure, particularly not imposing the shrinking to smaller residential lots or allowing commercial development in the residential zoning? Isn't it important to preserve the fabric of the community while patching the holes?
Yeah, it is. Lynn, do you want to start?
No, apparently. No.
Yeah, and we encountered this in a lot of the Michigan communities where they were very, very aware of there's tremendous historic value and cultural value to single family neighborhoods adjacent to downtowns. And so you have to be, that's why I showed that slide about mapping. You have to map that with care, because you don't want to destroy that fabric that is so rich in and of itself. And so I can't emphasize enough that the brain damage, and like Lynn said, the wandering in the woods that we went through over how to map it, because that really is where it's going to be successful or not.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. Susan, I agree with everything Susan said.
Okay, thank you. This is a question, I think, for Susan, but you can both respond. I've lived in a small mountain communities most of my adult life. Only recently have these towns started recognizing the benefits of the various streams and stormwater drainage patterns. I was wondering if any towns have expanded on this to build out their walkways along these stream beds rather than putting in walkways on the street, which often does not allow for the contours of the land. Can this be done as part of a storm drainage plan, or does it need to be done in conjunction with some other project?
Actually, I should punt that one to Lynn.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and I'm so sorry, John. Can you reread the first part of the question?
Okay, it talks about someone who was in small mountain communities most of their adult life. Only recently have these towns started recognizing the benefits of the streams and stormwater drainage patterns. She's wondering, or he is, if any towns have expanded on this to build out their walkways along these stream beds rather than putting in walkways on the street, which often does not follow the contours of the land.
Yeah, that's really difficult, and that absolutely has to be done in a more context base. We were working in Wells, Maine, that had a creek going through their downtown, and they wanted to revitalize or to actually create a downtown area. And by downtown, that's one block, one square block. So the context is, if you put a walkway next to following the contours of the stream, you could increase impervious cover, and also you're creating a kind of more a pedestrian walk versus moving pedestrians into or next to the retail area. So in my mind, it's not necessarily an either or. I do think putting walkways along streets and in your more pedestrian supportive or pedestrian focused environments is incredibly important. At the same time, if you wanted to attract attention down to the stream bed and look at integrative ways of doing stormwater management that can meet multiple community outcomes, that can help create a pedestrian experience while at the same time better managing your stormwater, that has to kind of be done in the context. The bottom line to answer, have we seen this done in other places, is yes, absolutely. Wells, Maine, I worked in. Covington, Kentucky, focused quite a bit on that. And it's one of the places, it's one of the things that we often recommend and see in working in communities is how best to use more green infrastructure or street level stormwater management as a way to create a more pedestrian environment. And in fact, when we talk about the project for code reform, our team has said, you know, we really need to tackle the stormwater piece next. So we're looking for partners who want to help us tackle that.
Okay. In a similar vein, I think this was a question received during Susan's presentation, saying that you mentioned that trying to apply pedestrian standards to areas that aren't pedestrian oriented today could be detrimental to those businesses. If that's the case, what can we do to improve those places if we want them to become more pedestrian friendly? Can you dig into this issue a little bit more?
Yes, thank you. And we, in the work that hasn't been published yet, but that CNU has been doing on the suburban environment for Michigan, we dealt with some of the, it depends on the context. So in commercial corridors, like in the state of Michigan, it depends on the era of the corridor. And there are some early streetcar suburbs where the corridor hasn't been blown out. And it's very possible for that to easily be urbanized, just with proper setbacks and parking location. And then there are some 1950s corridors where the lots are fairly shallow and the street is huge. And I don't know what it's like in the for the folks that are on the webinar, but in the state of Michigan, when I mean huge, I mean like it's an airport runway size of thoroughfare. And so in some of those situations, actually the recommendation of the team was if it's a shallow lot on a suburban arterial with no on-street parking and it's owned by the state DOT, don't, you know, that's like for 20 years from now when you have enlightened state DOT, there's really not much you can do in that condition today. Now, in the more late 20th century, early 21st.
That's for the state of Michigan. So we need to be clear that, that's within the state of Michigan and the particular challenges that they're facing. Sorry.
Right, but it's common in many, many, many states in the US. And then the final thing is there are more big box sort of lifestyle centers and regional commercial areas nowadays that are huge in depth. And in those situations, we recommend trying to create block structure internal to the block when it's facing a state-owned arterial. Now, so it's all about whether or not you can get on-street parking and decent sidewalks. And so the suburban issue, we don't throw that away. There are ways in which you can begin to transform it, but it has to be locally, we can't give you a rule that applies.
Contextual.
Right.
Right. We've gotten a few requests to make the slide decks available. Will you be able to do that?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
We will post it on the webinar archive page once we have those. Okay, next question here is, are auto-centric areas effectively lost to redesign? Is there a policy intervention to encourage and require improvement?
Well, I think that gets into the work that Susan's mentioned and I mentioned. So what we found in Michigan was that the more suburban condition, which they're calling corridors and something else, because many of the suburbs— shopping centers and corridors, which is very auto-centric, they were looking for incremental ways to see immediate improvement. And so that's the document that we'll be publishing. Again, it's in the context for the state of Michigan in sometime in September, I think. I think it's got to be done by the end of September. So there were, and we spent days talking about it because on the one hand, looking at your downtown area for new development, just put parking in the back. The fixes or the coding hacks seemed a little bit more straightforward. It became much more difficult when you're dealing with a more suburban centric, and I think slightly more complicated. So, but I just want to make a plug that that document is coming. It's mostly written. We're just moving into the layout and the design and the ground truthing of it. Susan, do you have anything you want to add on that?
The question, I think, was addressing policy, and you can absolutely address it at the policy level. You have to target in your comprehensive plan. You know, you can do a simple amendment with a map that shows strategic areas that you want to focus on suburban retrofit. And that's usually where you want to start, because it requires additional capital improvement funds associated with streetscape, et cetera. And so I would begin with a map at the comp plan level of your prioritization for suburban retrofit.
And then to align your infrastructure investments in a way that support that transformation. That's the other big piece of it.
Okay. And we'll say the questions keep pouring in, so thank you everybody who's sending them in the smallest towns with non-historic strip malls, how are you able to develop a downtown without rezoning the entire zoning structure, particularly not imposing the shrinking to smaller residential lots or allowing commercial development in the residential zoning? Isn't it important to preserve the fabric of a community while patching the holes?
Didn't we just answer that? But
I may have, sorry. That could be, like I said, they're pouring in here.
Yeah,
okay.
I think we that was asked and answered.
Gotcha. Okay. How did you engage the public with the Michigan plan, or what would you recommend to bring different types of communities together? For example, different socioeconomic statuses and races.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we came in, the C&U piece of this was really the technical area, and we relied significantly on our partners to bring that perspective. So we, as a first step, as we heard from, probably a half a dozen Michigan communities that were selected by the Michigan Municipal League. In addition, the Michigan Municipal League grounded us in the whole wide range of place types that existed within Michigan. We then our Michigan partners spent almost a year, what we're calling ground truthing the document, going around and working directly with the municipalities on what would work. Does this work for you? What are the barriers to implementation? What additional support? What's missing? What do you want? And the what's missing piece is where the suburban companion document came. We did not engage directly with the public in the way that we think about public engagement. And so this was so that I think absolutely has to be done more at the local level when a particular municipality is considering coding changes. So we've been asked a question before. It's like, well, are you just suggesting administrative hacks? There's still a process where the council needs to vote on it. But again, instead of voting on a whole code reform, they're only voting on, changing in one piece. So the public can be engaged in that as well. So that is, we haven't engaged directly with the public. And in terms of engaging and working directly with different socioeconomic and different races, looking at more equitable and inclusive development, we've just come out with Building Local Strength, emerging strategies for equitable and inclusive development that builds off of some of this. And as part of the project for code reform, we want to fold in kind of a standalone document that looks at all the different strategies for incrementally reforming and helping to revitalize these neighborhoods that are in desperate need of it.
Okay. My city is looking at accessory dwelling units and are currently considering creating a pre-approved catalog, which I believe is way too restrictive and will prevent creation of ADUs. They're also looking to restrict them just to owner-occupied properties. Again, this will restrict ADUs to only 10% of properties. Do you have any specific recommendations for establishing code for ADUs?
Yeah, we do.
All right, Susan, you go first, and then
No, go ahead.
No, you go first.
Well, it depends on your local politics and who's afraid of what. And I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is you want to get it done. So there will always be some things you need to compromise on, and that's okay. as long as you can get it done. And the thing to realize is ADUs impact infrastructure at every level. It impacts your school systems. It impacts, traffic congestion. It really does change. It does have an impact if it is done like Minneapolis is planning to do it. So if every single family lot suddenly is a 2-family lot, things change, especially water and sewer. So, first of all, don't be naive about why people are freaking out, because there are some reasons why you should freak out if it's not done cautiously. There are a number of ways we've seen it done. We usually limit it according to size. We don't recommend saying it's inclusive to the primary resident or it's its own structure. Some people go down that road. I think it's unnecessary. Where you'll find a lot of pushback is people want to increase on-site parking requirements, because frequently this is in single family, and we would really encourage you to try to fight against that one, because that's usually just going to create parking lots. And finally, the thing about owner-occupied, that's a little tightrope, because you want, I have no problem with rental, and I think most of our communities are wanting to see more rental. My husband and I are thinking about downsizing from single family, and frankly, we're going to start with rental because we'd like to be able to assess the neighborhood by living in it. So, but rental freaks out people that live in single family neighborhoods. And so, if you can avoid the owner occupied requirement, I think that's good, but just understand that's a very emotional issue for many people. And if it stands between you and getting it adopted, I'd roll on it.
The one piece that I wanted to talk about was that the city was pre-approving designs. Santa Cruz, California developed 5 specific designs to cover a wide range of different ADU types, such as converting a garage, putting a unit on top of a garage, converting a basement. And what Santa Cruz found is that by creating these plans, it streamlined the permit approval process, which saved the homeowner money. And these were architecturally approved plans, which also saved the homeowner money. So I can understand why you think it might stifle creativity, but in Santa Cruz's example, it really helped to accelerate the implementation and the building of more ADUs. By the way, for anything that you want to know on ADUs, you can go to www.accessorydwellings.org, might be .com. But there's all sorts of model ordinances and case studies that are done across the board. And I think increasingly, as a way of seeing our single family neighborhoods transform themselves, I do think that we will see an uptick in ADUs as a way of offering more affordable housing and more housing choices as family structures. I mean, at the end of the day, it's really about providing housing for different types of family structures. And ADUs enable a neighborhood to accommodate more family structures. So singles, millennials, people coming back, school teachers, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks. I will mention that we are talking with C, actually doing a webinar specifically on ADUs as well. There's a couple questions about mixed-use zoning that I'll combine here because I think they kind of fit together. And so part one is we are looking at a mixed-use zoning district as part of our historic downtown area. Should all new buildings be required to have mixed uses, or should some buildings be allowed to be totally residential apartments? And if there are height restrictions for a mixed-use zone, how important are density restrictions in conjunction with them?
You want to take that, Susan? I have one thing to say to add
okay.
to it.
Okay, so first of all, don't require explicit types of use. You don't have a crystal ball. You don't know what the market is going to be, and this is what we learned from the recession, is unless your community does, a biannual market study, you are not equipped as a planner to make those sorts of determinations. And so at the most, you can say on our main street, if you have one, we require storefronts or shop fronts. So you can require a frontage type that you want over time to be able to evolve through retail or office, but don't require a use, because we've seen way too many new buildings across the country that have sat empty through the recession because they were required to have retail on the first floor. So then about the height or the density, if you're controlling bulk standards, this is like the rule number 1 of urban coding. If you're controlling the bulk standards, the heights and the setback, that gives you and parking, whether or not you're controlling that, that gives you a very, very finite control over density and our FAR. And so there is no need to duplicate duplicate regulations that may or may not be in agreement. So anytime we're doing urban coding, we avoid densities and we avoid floor area ratios because we can handle it so well with bulk standards.
The one thing that I want to add to what Susan said about not requiring mixed use is that you need to think about what outcome you're trying to achieve. And then the outcome that you're trying to achieve is an active pedestrian realm, right? And so why don't you just say that, particularly in those areas like Main Street, and we all think a retail apocalypse is going to be coming soon. And so along your main streets, instead of requesting or requiring mixed use, definitely require an active first floor. And that can be done through a variety of different businesses, small scale manufacturing, a gym, except there are a lot of different ways to think about how to activate that pedestrian realm. So that's what we suggest, is to think about the outcome and to think about another way of getting there instead of just requiring a specific use.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. I will say that we did look up that website that you were just referencing, and it's accessorydwellings.org for the folks who are looking at that. Okay. Next question is, have you encountered a zoning ordinance that is based on a point system whereby building projects are required to incorporate uses and design elements from a shopping list, where the uses and design elements have predetermined points or ranges of points to achieve a minimum point threshold in order to qualify for building permit?
Yeah.
You, Susan, you're nodding your head, and I'm like, I've never heard of that.
Well, we've seen it. That was a typology that emerged from performance zoning back in the day, and it's very complicated to administer, and it will make your developers and builders nuts because it's just so far outside of the norm of zoning that people are used to. I don't know that I feel I don't have a real critique of what it produces, other than the fact that it's very difficult to implement successfully.
Here's another question. On the topic of addressing suburban arterials, what about the possibility of treating the access control arterial as an edge, almost like a river, and forcing adjoining uses to orient away from the arterial and secondary streets?
Yeah, that's a great strategy. And on larger parcels, like a shopping center area, you do have the depths that you can begin to create internal block structure, and then you can do skinny multimodal streets as opposed to the arterial. We frequently use that in a suburban context.
Okay. Here's a question about smart growth in general. With a growing realization that we're running up against natural limits, that growth is a term that is incongruent with the changes that need to take place, is there any consideration in changing your name vis-a-vis what British Petroleum did by going beyond petroleum? What about smart and great communities?
I think, John, that's a question for you. We're the Congress for the New Urbanism. We don't have smart growth in our name, though many of our members think we need to drop the new. So, John, that's to you.
Okay, good point. Good point. Can you speak on zoning reform with the context of marginalized communities and perhaps any non-traditional engagement techniques?
Oh yeah. Oh, Susan, can I take this and then you jump on?
Yeah.
When I do my stump speech, I talk about the non-traditional techniques, and I have photos from all over the country that have engaged them, such as a chalkboard in the middle of a parking lot in Milwaukee that says, "What should I be next?" Or a storefront with Post-it notes in Topeka, Kansas, which is, "What should I be next?" There is a great potential in using all of the new technology, but I think we've kind of gotten away from going out into the communities. I love the story of creative placemaking from the Twin Cities, I think Minneapolis, whereby they create a rickshaw with the plan, and go out into the communities to engage, to enable people to come out of their houses, the planning department to talk about what's next. So I think that's really, really interesting. I strongly suggest for any planning department to really engage in the wide range of kind of innovative and non-traditional approaches. And in much the same way that some of our members now are calling for an end of single-family zoning, I'm calling for the end of the 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. public meeting, because nobody feels heard. It just feels like a monumental waste of time. And then if we got rid of that, what are the other areas? What are the different ways that we can really engage the public? And that becomes increasingly important if we're working directly in traditionally disenfranchised populations. Instead of requiring people to come to you, why don't you go to them? It becomes so important and essential to be working with leaders in that community, whether it is the pastor, the store owner. It requires a lot of hard work to identify who the leaders in that neighborhood are and to work directly with them and to empower them. King County in Washington has what's called a pro-equity approach. The consultants, the staff, et cetera, who are engaging in these areas are paid to show up into a meeting. So why don't we pay the public to also show up and to pay these organizations that we're partnering with? And so it's not a lot of money, but the way that they frame it is that it provides everybody on a more equal basis, and they call it a pro-equity approach. I strongly urge folks to go onto King County's website and to look for that. I think it's incredibly innovative, and that's a really strong way of ensuring that these underrepresented voices are heard and their concerns are taken into consideration.
I think Lynn covered it.
Oh, thanks.
Okay. Here's a question. What do you both think of Minneapolis's decision to prohibit single-family zoning?
Well, they haven't done it yet. They've established a policy, and we work a fair amount in Hennepin County, and which is where Minneapolis is, and it's great. They're required within a year to update their zoning to match their comprehensive plan, and how that's going to be all negotiated at the end of the day remains to be seen. There's a lot of thought locally amongst the city staff and professional planners that it will be done via ADUs, where they'll be permitted by right in all single-family districts. Because my husband's family's all from there, and I know those people quite well. I'll believe it when I see it, but it's a great policy. It's a great policy.
I'm going to jump in here. I know less about this, not as much as Susan does about the specifics, but I encourage people to think about the neighborhoods in Chicago, the brownstones in New York and in Brooklyn, the brownstones that we have in Capitol Hill in DC. All of these homes were built at one point as a single family house, and they had been transformed over the decades to multifamily, that there was a standalone apartment in each floor. So as we think about how we can transform our suburbs and to enable greater housing, at the end of the day, the design of the house stays the same, but what we're enabling is different uses, essentially multifamily within the home. And so I think that that's really important to keep in mind, and how this has been done in our beloved cities.
Okay. Here's a comment and a question. Thanks for the webinar. My question is, would this kind of zoning reform cause gentrification and displacement? Do you have any strategy about how to prevent displacement?
Oh, that's not an easy question. So, well, that's not it's backing up. So when we think about, here's my rant on gentrification. I don't necessarily think that gentrification is a bad thing. What we're talking about is investing in areas that have seen decades of disinvestment. The tricky part is how do we do it in a way that minimizes displacement and increases access to opportunities for all the legacy residents? So I feel that gentrification has become this buzzword. We don't want to gentrify, but when you talk to the community members, they were like, I would like to see additional investment in my area, in my neighborhood. I just want to be able to access the opportunities that come after that and to be able to stay. So again, we just published this report called Building Local Strength, Emerging Strategies for Inclusive and Equitable Development. And we touch on, I think we list about 15 different policies and zoning changes that can be done. But this is an area that I would really like to see the Project for Code Reform dive in more deeply. To answer the very specific question is, do we think this document will lead to gentrification or displacement? I don't really, because somebody else has mentioned about filling in the holes and whatnot. These are very small scale changes that a community can take to just start the process of transforming itself to get to this outcome of a more holistic and walkable, vibrant place. It doesn't take you all the way there. There's a lot more work to get all the way there. And I think because it's done incrementally and slowly, there's actually advantages for other people to access and advantages for the legacy residents to really be able to access some of the results and the opportunities. And then I have to talk about the work of John Anderson and the Incremental Development Alliance. They're going around working predominantly in underserved communities on a developer boot camp. So to teach very basic development skills to this neighborhood. So the developers aren't coming in, they're being homegrown. And I think that that's another key piece to that. Let's try to empower the residents living in these areas that have seen decades of disinvestment, and give them the tools to, and the financing and the support and the mentorship and the training, all of it to enable them to transform their own neighborhoods.
Thank you. And thanks for all the questions. If it's okay with the panelists, we'll go over a couple minutes to ask a few more, if that will work for you all.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Okay, it was mentioned that we should look to control intensity without being overly prescriptive about use. What are some practical metrics for measuring intensity as a proxy for use?
Well, height is probably a primary measurement, and setbacks. So you can, through height and setbacks, you can very clearly differentiate. Say you're in a historic, let's use Savannah. Well, no, let's not use Savannah. Let's use Boston. So if you're in Back Bay, Boston. Well, any city in the U.S. is fine. You have your downtown, that's one intensity, one height, usually a 0 setback. Let's say it's a mid-sized city, so 5 stories, 0 setback. You go into the adjacent neighborhoods where things start to transition. You still have corner shops and cafes, and but it's more and more residential with missing middle, blended density. And it's going to go from 5 to 3, and the setbacks, you can still do zeros, but suddenly you can have some wiggle room in the front. You may have 8-foot setbacks for a dooryard with the front garden, etc. And then you get into what's historically your single family, and we'll call that low intensity, and that's 2 stories, and it may have It may have a 10-foot front setback, but it could go as much as 16 or 20. So you're going to completely change the character of your zoning districts just with height and front setback, frankly.
Okay, thank you. As a 30-year veteran, I agree that zoning codes are broken. The approach you have developed is promising, but I also think that planners have gotten a bad rap because in most places they are the plan reviewers, regulators, and enforcers. For example, the planning director promoting form-based codes as a good economic development strategy is also the person called into the mayor's office when the developer because they can't get their plan approved. My belief is that the role of as an enforcer and regulator takes away from the role of the voice of reason and best practices. If you see this as a barrier, how do you suggest avoiding this when enacting form-based regulations?
So before Susan starts, I just want to underscore one thing, that what we are talking about in the Project for Code Reform is code agnostic. These are changes that can be integrated into a form-based code or into Euclidean zoning. So this is not what we've been talking about today, is not a form-based code per se. There are elements in it in terms of being grounded in place, but I do want to underscore that this is code agnostic. Susan, you can answer the technical aspect.
Well, it's a very real problem, and like in Michigan, we saw one guy, and it was a guy, so that's, I'm not being gender specific there. He was the director of economic development, he was a public works director, he was a planning director, and he was a zoning administrator. One person wearing 4 hats. And so he was both the visionary and he was absolutely the enforcer. And I have no idea how you could stay in that job, because this gentleman was probably 60 years old. I have no idea how you could tolerate that for your entire career. So we understand the burden you all carry is enormous. And, you know, as policy wonks and code nerds and consultants, it's easy for us to make recommendations, and we know it's an altogether different ballgame for you guys to implement it, which is why Lynn had this brilliant idea of the Project for Code Reform, because it's about giving you the smallest change to affect the largest impact with the least political requirements. And so it doesn't solve your problem. And, you know, in the best of all possible worlds, you would have the visionary, the planning director, and the enforcer, the zoning administrator, and you guys could work in harmony, but you wouldn't be having to do the same job. And so that really is why this isn't, like Lynn said, this isn't a form-based code. The form-based code is the, if you can do everything, you have all the political will, you have all of the local support, you have all of the staff capacity, that is the gold standard, go for it. But that's not what this is about. This really is about the little changes, the things that you can do wherever you are.
And that's why we think it's disruptive, because there are so few places that can align all of the political will, the resources, the staff resources, and have the expertise to do a form-based code well. So if that's the gold standard and you can't meet that just yet, what can you do in the interim? And that's why we call this a disruption.
Okay, that makes sense. Just a couple more before we conclude. I'm interested in your suggestions about how to incrementally redevelop strip shopping centers with traditional parking in front to push the buildings to the front and the parking to the rear. So a way to do that?
Well, it so much depends on the geometry. So if you have a deep lot and you can do internal streets, we recommend that you try it from that perspective. It's just a lot easier to build a new street. And frankly, I hope there aren't too many public works directors or fire marshals on the call, but if you can if you can build it as a drive aisle rather than a street, but then make it act like a street, you know, with nice sidewalks and on-street parking, et cetera, then it's like a little tweak. It's a loophole where you can get further toward the goal of a walkable mixed-use place. But so much of the limitations on the suburban condition depend on who owns the road and whether or not on-street parking is permitted. And if you cannot anticipate in the next 10 years getting on-street parking, then you're going to have to turn your back on the arterial, because you can't make that. It will not survive without on-street parking and wider sidewalks as an urban place.
And the other thing, and I'm surprised Susan didn't mention it because it was her brother who did this, in Tukwila, when there was that big parking lot right on the main street, Steve, Susan's brother, suggested this kind of incremental approach to putting in, to essentially encasing that big parking lot, first with food trucks, and then with sheds, and then with liner buildings. And it was this kind of progression to build the demand. And so I thought, I've used that example quite a bit, Susan, because I thought it was really interesting. Again, this idea of incremental approach to build, to do something now, quick and dirty, and then wait for the market to build. So you move from food trucks to sheds to liner buildings.
Okay, two more. Is there a larger philosophical question with alternative housing such as ADUs? Do we as planners need to consider the human consequences of encouraging and incentivizing less independent housing with community development ramifications? As someone who's lived in an ADU, I found it quite challenging to feel like I was part of the community. You're attached to whoever lives in the primary residence and their whims.
Huh, that's funny. I've lived in an ADU as well, in an apartment above a garage. My son and I did in Cambridge. I loved it. I didn't feel that way at all. So I mean, that's the only thing that I have to add to it. I think that the family structure in the 21st century is changing. The census data shows that by like 2030, or it might be 2040, excuse me, that there'll be less than 25% of the population that is living in like a two-parent household with children. So we're creating a whole wide range of different family structures, including multi-generational families based on want and desire versus bloodlines, you know, singles, etc. So I think we need to create new housing structures that support the changing family. Eli Spivak in Portland, as a for example, is experimenting with new housing types that are based on the old SRO, but SRO as an independent room, and then you have a shared kitchen. So really changing the whole dynamic of how that operates. So I'm sorry for the person's experience with an ADU. Mine was very different, but I do want to encourage all of us to start thinking about, again, the new housing types that better reflect the changing needs and desires of our family structures.
I'd like to add just one thing to that, and it's an interesting conundrum, because if you're living essentially on the rear lane, if you're living in a flat above a garage or in a rear building, in many ways you have a different public realm, depending on what your access is through the yard. So I can see where that could be tricky. And as a result, that's one reason why I think you really need to emphasize as you're doing your ADU or your housing, whatever zoning rewrite you're doing for alternative housing formats, you need to consider where people can gather. What is the public space? And if you don't have requirements for, we call it civic space in form-based code world, but for parks and squares and plazas and playgrounds and even pocket parks and community gardens and places where people can find a place to be a part of the larger community, I think that's really important to successful alternative housing formats.
Good points.
Okay, so one last question which we received from a number of folks. Can you tell us how we can get you to come to our community?
You know, I kept meaning to do a slide on that. Yes, so you need to contact Mallory. She's going to hate this.
She's going to hate you.
There's still 300 people online. You need to contact Mallory Batches of CMU staff, and that's MBACHES cnu.org. And John, you all can probably make that available. And again, we do this work from a research component. We're not a consulting firm. We're a nonprofit organization with an education and research based mission. So we want to work in communities that have a tricky issue that we haven't yet developed and that we think that we haven't yet addressed, and that we think other communities or states are also grappling with that. And so that it's a little bit, it's not, you hire a consultant, comes in and gives you a widget. We're not interested in that. We're interested in exploring a wide range of solutions that work not only for you, but that we feel can be expanded to other communities. So we feel that there's a lot more research that needs to be done on this. So happy to field calls on that. But I did want to make that small little kind of bit. But Susan's available too.
Great. Well, thank you both today. This will conclude our webinar, Coding for Communities, a Pragmatic Guide to Zoning Reform. Again, this is Michael Bayer from the Maryland Department of Planning, and I'd like to offer a big thank you to our presenters for a great presentation and to all those who attended. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org later this week. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a very short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye out on smartgrowth.org and our weekly e-newsletter for details on other future webinars, including more sessions with CNU. And those of you who participated through CNU, if you want to subscribe to our e-newsletter, please visit smartgrowth.org. We have also posted the registration link for a webinar entitled Designing for Resilience Across Scales, Systems, and Sectors on August 14th. So please visit our website to register for that, and have a great day.